Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on global inequality, globalization, and global warming. Should call that climate catastrophe or climate emergency, but I thought global just had a nice ring to it. So here we go, and this is the last episode of Fox Sociology. Okay, global stratification. There's a few definitions here. And you probably noticed that some countries are rich and some countries are poor. And we can think about why in a bit here. So here's a definition from my Anderson and Taylor, authors of my last, an old textbook. The systemic inequalities between and among different groups within nations that result from the differences in wealth, power, and prestige of different societies relative to their position in the international economy. So we're back to wealth, power, and prestige. Think of Max Weber, okay? Think of wealth, power, prestige, all that stuff. So there's a different societies have different wealth, power, and prestige, and they can have their way more in the international economy. So there's three theories about modernization, global stratification I want to talk about. So this comes from the World Bank. That's old. You don't have to look at that, or I'll get to that in a bit. Actually, that's a little bit old. So modernization theory is the idea that global development is a worldwide process affecting nearly all societies that have been touched by technological change. Okay, that's from Anderson and Taylor. Much of the stuff I also get from John Isbister in his book Promises Not Kept. Okay, so countries become modernized through technological development, and it's just a process and a matter of time before all countries are developed. What hinders development are the traditions and values of the country. Modernization theorists believe that traditional societies are fatalistic, not valuing hard work, not saving, and they do not control their fertility. They also say that poor people in less developed countries are more likely to see their plight as determined by fate or karma or something like that, so they are less likely to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Therefore, economic development arises from relinquishing traditional cultural values and embracing new technologies and market-driven attitudes and practices. Modernization theorists also state that government should not interfere with the economies, be as quote free trade as possible. Sometimes they do think that there is a role for developed countries to play to assist economic development. Now, W. Rostow looked at the four stages of modernization. And likened it to an airplane taking off. The first stage is the traditional stage, okay? People in the traditional societies cannot imagine what it's like to live otherwise, so they keep adhering to their traditions. And this keeps them spiritually rich, but living in poverty. Then there's the takeoff stage. The airplane's about to take off. Or takes off, I should say. As a society shakes off the grip of tradition, people start using their imagination, and that sparks economic growth. So a market emerges. People produce goods to trade with others. There's also an increase in individualism, a willingness to take risks, and a desire for material goods takes hold. Okay. Third is the drive to market maturity. Growth becomes an accepted cultural norm, and that contributes to people's pursuit of higher living standards. At the same time, a lot of the traditional family and local community life becomes eroded. And then finally, high mass consumption. People soon learn to need the expanding array of goods produced as economic development steadily raises living standards and mass production stimulates consumption. So some modernization theorists say that developed economies can contribute to economic development of less developed countries by exporting birth control to control population, increase food production, so exporting high-yield farming methods to raise agricultural yields, introducing industrial technology to from farming to skilled industrial, and then providing foreign aid. Investment capital from rich countries can assist in the takeoff stage. Modernization has occurred in some countries, but not others. Japan is a very good example of this, but it's really thinly veiled defense of capitalism in some ways, and it's similar to the culture of poverty argument that is touched on in the text and stuff. But basically, it's basically blaming people for their own lack of economic development, for their own poverty. So, like, if this country is poor, it's their fault because they keep adhering to traditional cultural values and things like that. So, one moment, please. Okay. The second is dependency theory. This is a theory that states that the poverty of low-income countries is a direct result of their political and economic dependence on wealthy countries and the exploitation by wealthy countries. So industrialized nations hold the less industrialized nations in a dependency relationship, which benefits the industrialized nations at the expense of less industrialized ones. Okay, this looks at the history of the poorest countries in the world, and they see that a lot of them are former colonies. In the 1600s, European countries were starting to industrialize, and they needed raw materials, so they looked around the world. Okay, and they entered into relationships with other countries that's characterized by colonialism, which is a system which Western nations became wealthy by taking raw materials from colonized societies and reaping profits from products finished in their homeland. They go to Africa, oppress some people, get some iron ore, things like that, bring it back, make a tractor. Okay. So after World War II, it became too cumbersome to administer a bunch of countries. So many colonies attained political independence, but they were still economically dependent on the colonizers. Okay. So they go into a relationship called neocolonialism. Rich countries control poor countries without direct control. Okay. So a bit of legacy from today. If we look at the top, that should say 2018. Okay, at the top there, countries with the highest gross national income per capita, 2018. This is from the World Bank. Okay. So the countries, so a lot of them are like big winners in a lot of the modern economy here. Qatar, Macau, Singapore, places like that. So there's some Middle Eastern countries. Then you go down, you see more and more countries that are European or connected with Europe in some way. Macau, Singapore had a relationship there. Hong Kong, Ireland, Norway, U.S., Denmark. Okay, a lot of European stuff here. We look at the poor countries, mostly Africa. Okay. Burundi, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Niger, Liberia, Mozambique, Malawi, Sierra Leone, etc. Okay, Madagascar. Okay, so there's this legacy of colonialism that happens today. Okay, so multinational corporations also play a role in this, in which they buy the cheapest materials and highest the cheapest labor. Okay, so this theory is not bad in explaining a lot of world poverty, but it's not perfect. Not all countries are former colonies, like Ethiopia. And some former colonies, like Singapore and Hong Kong, have done well. So it's good in some ways, but it's not perfect. Okay. My favorite theory, though, is world systems theory. This is the idea that capitalism is a single world economy and that there's a worldwide system of unequal political and economic relationships that benefit the technologically advanced societies at the expense of the less technologically advanced societies. Okay. It's a lot like dependency theory, but it's looking at the world. This theory comes from a guy named Immanuel Wallerstein, who wrote volumes on something called the modern world system. So in this theory, the level of economic development is explained by understanding each country's place and role in the world economic system. There are three different types of countries. The core are the countries that are the richest, and they profit the most from the world system. The periphery are mostly agricultural, poor, but they tend to have resources that are exploited by the core countries. And then semi-periphery, that extract profits from the periphery and pass them to the core. Okay, so when you see, like on shirts, when you see countries where where they are made in, okay, they're likely to be a semi-peripheral country. So let's look at a map here, and what's core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So the core countries are U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. Okay. The periphery is Central America, Caribbean nations, Western South America, most of Africa. In fact, all of Africa but one country, which is South Africa, is semi-periphery. Russia, but many people put Russia as semi-periphery nowadays. Okay, so there's a debate about that. Much Eastern Europe is considered periphery. Also, many people will put Saudi Arabia as semi-periphery now. Okay, semi-periphery. Let's see. China, India. That's Iran. Okay. South Africa, Brazil, and Argentina, I think, and Mexico. Again, where are things made? Oh yeah, some of the Micronesian countries also. Okay, think about where things are made. Like where like the tags on clothing. You get like made in China, made in India, made in Mexico, etc. Okay, so and there are some countries of less than 1 million people that weren't part of the analysis at this time. Okay, so what does this lead to then? We've got similar situations of what happens with dependency theory. You get narrow export-oriented economies. Poor nations produce only a few crops for export. And as for raw materials, the multinational corporations can purchase raw materials cheaply and transport them overseas to process them for profitable sale. Therefore, poor countries develop few industries of their own. There is a lack of industrial capacity. Since there's no industrial base, poor countries count on rich countries to buy their raw materials and then must buy them back as manufactured goods. So, if a country produces iron ore, the rich countries take it, turn it into steel, and then make a tractor, and sell the tractor back to the poor country at a more expensive price. Therefore, it takes more iron to get a tractor. Sorry, I have allergies, and it's interfering with a lot of things. So, okay, let's keep going with this. And if worse comes to worse, there's foreign debt. This leads because poor countries cannot afford a tractor, they get into debt. Okay. This can paralyze a country's economy. Debt can do that. Okay. And it makes them even more dependent upon others. Okay. So, you read a piece on globalization. I'm not going to get into it very much. Globalization is a process whereby goods, information, people, money, communication, fashion, and other forms of culture move across national boundaries. So that's by Stanley Einstein and Maxine Bakazin. That is in your readings. Okay. So the world is getting smaller. That's what we have to say here. So what do we think about this? Well, some people defend globalization because it is, the defenders of globalization say it's superior free markets over government economic planning. Okay, capitalism is better than socialism. They came up with the Washington Consensus, saying that free markets would provide the most effective means of helping poor countries as well as energizing sluggish developed economies. Okay. They basically say that regulations interfere with economic growth. Take away the regulations, okay? Take away regulations and there will be growth, okay? The dissenters say that as commodities, labor, and capital move across borders, some sovereign nations' power will be reduced to powerlessness. So what happens is that the multinational corporations are the ones that are more powerful, okay? So, and other companies can flourish, okay? And it doesn't really help the local sovereign nations as much. For example, you might be familiar with the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, okay? That NAFTA decimated a lot of jobs in Mexico, about 2 million farming jobs, agriculture jobs, because the corn market was flooded in Mexico by subsidized corn from the United States. Okay, so more companies get more power and things like that. Okay, there's destabilizing conditions in poor countries, a race to the bottom. So if you have iron ore and a neighboring country has iron ore, well, what happens is that you start competing against one another to sell iron ore to the rich countries. So you're like, so you're undervaluing the iron ore because you have to sell it to develop, but then it takes more iron ore to get a tractor again. Okay, environmental problems. We'll get to some of that in a bit, and the extensions of capitalism with all of its shortcomings. So remember, when I talked about alienated labor, because Marx criticized capitalism, one reason because of alienated labor. One of the biggest, the ultimate form of alienated labor, I think, is slavery. Okay, you don't even own yourself. This is the ultimate loss of self. You have no freedom. Okay, so keeping that in mind, I want you to watch Not My Life on Canopy. Okay, so this would be a good place to pause and go ahead and watch that. And the next class part is on the climate crisis.